I just think, so Jake and I both are approaching that 3-year mark. With any sport, not even just sports, anything you do for 3 years, if you don't get somewhat good at it by that time, like stop.
To the winner by split decision from the United Kingdom, the Nightmare, KSI.
It is game over. What'd you think about him? What'd you think about Logan Paul? He says he wants to take this sport seriously. What do you think about him?
He's a tough, rough competitor. It was, good action, have fun, and I was surprised by him tonight. Good little work, good guy. Great young fighter, strong, tough. He's better than I thought he was.
Well, let's test out your idea, Mr. Paul. What's up guys, Kiwi MMA here. So how good is Logan Paul's boxing really? I mean, the guy put on 2 blockbuster events with KSI, as well as actually shared the ring with boxing's GOAT and Floyd Mayweather, though we know how that turned out. But how does his boxing skill compare to, say, relative to the rest of the YouTube boxing community? Does Logan Paul actually have any real skill or potential for the sport of boxing? And is he better or worse than his brother Jake? At the recording of this video, the Logan Paul Floyd Mayweather circus has already ended, and while we await the announcement for his next boxing match, let's take a look at his 2 fights with KSI, as well as his fight against Floyd Mayweather, and analyze his boxing skills and potential from a technical perspective. What kind of interesting things did we learn from watching these 3 fights? Well, you'll just have to stick around and find out. Real quick, this is Kiwi MMA, and if you're new here and enjoy combat sports breakdowns, especially on more unconventional fighters or matchups like YouTube boxers, then please subscribe to the channel below, and let me know in the comments what you think of Logan Paul's boxing. Is he better than Jake? Do you think he has some legit skill? I want to hear from you guys. And without further ado, let's jump into this. So I just want to note before we jump into this breakdown, obviously a lot of the techniques we're going to be talking about here are going to be pretty low level compared to, say, more accomplished professional boxers. So just keep in mind when I compliment or point out the more positive aspects of Logan's boxing, this is all with the acknowledgement that he has a limited training background and skill set compared to, say, Billy Joe Saunders, Canelo, etc. With that said, the first thing that really jumps out to me with Logan in his first fight against KSI is his explosive jab and straight punches. Right, Logan was the longer fighter, Logan was more the counterpuncher in this fight. He was really content to stay on the outside and pick and probe at KSI with his jab, whereas KSI's whole game plan was to try to get on the inside, throw some wild looping overhands that he's known for, and try to catch Logan over the top and really make this into a dogfight. So Logan, pretty much in the beginning, just stood in front of KSI the whole time. Right, there wasn't a lot of footwork or moving around going on Logan's end. He wasn't circling out, he wasn't using any lateral movement, he wasn't L-stepping to reset the action. He was basically just waiting for KSI to make a move. And when Logan did use his footwork, it was mainly in straight lines, which we'll talk more on his footwork later, but Logan looked to establish his jab early. Right, Logan being the faster and more explosive fighter, and also having the reach advantage, he was likely going to catch KSI early in these exchanges. Now, KSI was very aware of Logan's jab, and he looked to slip back with his head movement to avoid it, as well as parry it away with his right hand. Now, Logan picked up on this, as well as figured out he couldn't just sit on the outside and jab KSI the whole time, so he started to feint with his lead hand to get the parrying reaction of KSI and use this to set up his power hands. So in this exchange, Logan feints with a jab, which triggers the parry from KSI, and KSI moves back. Now, if KSI had stayed stationary here, the left hook probably would have been open, but he moved back, so Logan throws the left hook and kind of uses it to measure for his straight right, which he lands right down the pipe. So the speed and explosiveness element was really evident from Logan early on. Now, Logan did a similar thing also towards the end of the first round, where again, he's showing KSI his lead hand, which triggers the parry from KSI. KSI's focusing all his attention on the lead hand of Logan, that his own lead hand is totally down and his left side is completely open. We'll talk more about this in the breakdown, but both these guys were able to keep their right hands up to parry each other's jabs, but their lead left hands were down almost the complete fight. So every time each of these guys landed the power hand, a big part of it was both of them were just completely defensively unsound and would drop their lead hands constantly. So again, Logan feints with a jab, and KSI tries to parry with his right hand, but his left side is open, so Logan lands a short right overhand over the top. He then follows it up with a jab, which is something Logan likes to finish his combos with, in this fight at least. And then KSI kind of just walks in nonchalantly here. I don't know if he was just rocked from the punch and didn't realize where he was spatially. But Logan lands a cool combo here, jab, left hook, straight right down the pipe, and then he finishes off with another jab. So Logan was able to have some success early on by getting KSI to respect his jab as well as his speed and athleticism, and then being able to use the jab to set up for other things. So in the second round, we got to see some of Logan's more defensive and countering tendencies, because this is where JJ started to really download the data and really step up his offense. Right, just like how Logan was anticipating JJ would parry his jab, JJ started to anticipate when Logan would throw the jab. So Logan would throw the jab, and then JJ would try to come forward and counter him with his own right overhand. And for the most part, Logan didn't react to this very well. KSI started to feint and would kind of come forward and use some kind of weird, sloppy, unorthodox movement to set up his overhand, like in this exchange. And at times he would get a bit lulled by KSI's feints and unorthodox movement. And like I mentioned before, one reason why the counter overhand from KSI was so effective was Logan would drop his lead hand pretty much every single time. Right after he threw a jab, he wouldn't retract it back to his face, which is usually good form, and he would just leave it down even when he wasn't throwing whatsoever. So Logan's left side was completely open the entire fight, and KSI exploited this. Now, Logan had some defenses and counters to KSI's overhands, some of which were successful and some others not so much. He would try to land the check left hook, which even though it's a looping punch, it's shorter than an overhand, so typically you could land on the inside, but he could never quite get KSI's timing down. Sometimes he'd just shuffle backwards, which, is good to evade the overhand at the very least. And another thing he would do is he would often duck under KSI's jab or overhand and just initiate the clinch whenever he felt unsafe. Which, giving his wrestling base and strength advantage, wasn't really a bad thing to do here. But really the only counter that Logan had against KSI's overhand that had any success was his lean back right hook. And you can see that in this exchange here where, similar to the previous exchange where Logan had some success feinting with his lead hand and throwing his right, here he throws his straight right again, but notice KSI is downloading the data here and actually anticipates this, so he leans back himself and throws his own counter overhand. Now, KSI, similar to Logan Paul, would often overextend himself after his power shots and completely drop his hands, so Logan would punish him here by leaning back and throwing his own right hook, and then he'd follow up with a right cross. This is probably the only counter Logan had any success with the whole night. And then again, Logan had some success doing what Jake did to Deji, where he would feint with his lead hand, which would trigger the parry reaction from KSI. He would then come over the top of the left hook, and then come straight down the pipe with the right hand. Anytime Logan could feint with his lead hand and get KSI to start to parry, he usually would have some success with this combination. But then Logan would start to bite on a lot of KSI's feints as well, so here KSI feints up high and goes to the body twice. So KSI goes feint, body shot, feint, body shot. And then on the third feint, KSI feints up high, and then instead of coming to the body, comes right over top of the right overhand, which completely catches Logan off guard. And you can see Logan wanted the check left hook here, but he couldn't quite get KSI's timing down. He would bite on a lot of his feints, and it allowed for KSI to land the bigger, more looping punch in these scenarios. It's interesting because Logan was clearly trying to be more the counterpuncher in this fight, but his ability to download data and get a read on KSI was actually far inferior to KSI's ability to read Logan. But you could still see that the speed and explosiveness of Logan would catch KSI off guard, because right after this combination from KSI, Logan jumps right into a 1-2-1 combination, and it just catches KSI clean. Right, it really wasn't so much Logan's countering that worked against KSI, it was more so when he would feint and get a reaction at KSI, and he would kind of just come forward quickly with the combination, or he'd catch KSI in space with his speed. Right, that was where Logan had a lot more success. But as the fight went on, we started to see Logan get more and more fatigued. And, this is obviously due to, it's his first amateur fight, so there's more nerves and stress there. That's where the adrenaline dump can come in. But also his explosiveness and lack of experience in managing his energy, right? Logan's a very explosive fighter, so he's going to be expending a lot more energy per punch. And, if you're in a new environment, it's a new situation for you, you've never been here before, you're not going to know how to pace yourself effectively. You're not going to know when to explode and when not to. So we started to see Logan slow down even right into the third round. And with Logan slowing down like he didn't have a lot of success in the later rounds being able to unload on his combinations. And you start to see Logan throwing the same combinations over and over again, like here he throws the 1-1-2, which actually lands against KSI, he lands the right hand right down the middle, but look how he completely plants himself in space, right? He completely overextends, he doesn't have an exit strategy, he doesn't dip out on his right away from KSI, he just basically plants himself right in space, and KSI completely punishes him here by leaning back and throwing his own counter right overhand. KSI would pressure Logan up against the fence, and he did kind of manage to circle out at one point, but a lot of times he just kind of get trapped there and not really know what to do and kind of just rely on the clinch. And Logan really wanted that lean back right hook counter against KSI's overhand, but if he couldn't land it, he just kind of looked lost. Right? He would throw it, and if he missed, KSI would just continue to come forward with a flurry of punches, and Logan just didn't know how to operate in that realm of space. Like if he had more elusive footwork in this fight, he could have continued to circle out, he could have pivoted away, he could have tried to reset the action, he could have L-stepped away, but instead, KSI would continue to come forward and Logan just didn't know what to do. And this is another important aspect of this fight for Logan. Logan didn't have a proper understanding of how to counter an overhand right at all in this fight. Like, I'll give KSI credit in this fight, he was very scrappy, and, he would come forward, had great pressure, and at times he would set up his overhand right, but there were some moments where he would just telegraph the crap out of it and throw it out there like it was a missile. And there's a lot of ways Logan could have countered this, the most easiest being he could have just blocked it with his left hand. Right? Using your high guard with your lead hand to block it, and then at that point you've blocked it and you can return with your own counters if you want to. So Logan could have just blocked with his left hand and then followed it up with his own right cross or right uppercut, and that would have really put KSI on notice. He could have also shoulder rolled it Philly shell style, he could have slipped underneath it and looked for a counter, or he could have just ducked under it completely and countered with the left hook. Right? There was a lot of options Logan had to counter this shot, but unfortunately it just looked like he lacked the understanding and the boxing IQ to handle it. So on a positive note, Logan had some pretty decent skills that he showcased in this fight. But like I mentioned, there was a lot of room for work here. I mean, Logan's footwork, as I mentioned, was completely lacking. He pretty much did not show any lateral movement in this fight whatsoever. He completely moved back and forth in straight lines, and most of the time he kind of just stood in front of KSI. He didn't know how to pace himself effectively. His cardio was an issue, he would explode too much. And I mean, KSI was guilty for this as well, but Logan was completely defensively unsound. I mean, his hands were pretty low almost the entirety of the fight. His lack of using his left guard was really troubling here. But how would Logan compare in the rematch with KSI? I mean, this whole first fight, he said he was just getting his sea legs and it was his first professional boxing match, but what improvements and skill set would he show in the second fight? Well, in some ways he made a lot of great improvements, and in other ways he kind of completely dropped the ball. And a lot of Logan's improvements in this fight were more defensive than offensive, particularly his footwork and his ability to defend the overhands. So one thing that was very readily apparent from the onset of this fight was Logan was a lot more mobile than the first fight. Right, as I said, in the first fight, Logan was very stationary. He would basically just move back and forth in straight lines, and after throwing punches, he wouldn't really have much of an exit strategy. But in this fight, every aspect of his footwork improved, so starting with just how he would shuffle away from KSI's overhand. Right? I mean, this isn't rocket science, but I mean, this is a very common defense against the overhand. You just shuffle back and move away. But Logan wouldn't just plant himself. A lot of the times he'd shuffle back and move away, and then he would circle right back to the middle. And what this did is it allowed Logan not only to reset the action in the fight, but it also allowed him to just get in a more efficacious position for his offense. So a lot of the fight exchanges would play out like this. KSI would come forward and try to set up for his right overhand. Logan would shuffle back and lean away from the right overhand. And then after leaning away, he would circle back to the middle or the center of the ring, so he was the one dictating the distance in the fight, and he was in a better position. At this point, KSI is against the ropes, and Logan is the one coming forward. So this not only put Logan in a better position offensively, but it allowed Logan not to be the one who was pressured. Because remember in the first fight, every time KSI had Logan against the ropes, he just didn't know what to do, and he got scared, and he would often clinch up. So by using this footwork, again, very simple footwork, it just allowed him to evade the overhands and get back to a better position in the ring. And Logan started to incorporate the right high guard every time he would shuffle back and circle away from KSI, and there's actually a reason why he did this. So early in the fight, KSI would come forward with his right overhand, and then he started to, after throwing it, throw a follow-up looping left overhand afterwards. And this caught Logan hard early on, so he started to actually make an adjustment and started to use the right high guard every time he circled away, just in case that left looping overhand caught him. Because we know KSI will just throw wild punches, and sometimes they just come from weird angles and directions, so this was a good adjustment from Logan. Now, while that was an improvement, it kind of boggles my mind that he didn't utilize the left high guard when KSI would throw his right overhand. Like I mentioned in the last fight, he could have easily countered him just by blocking that right overhand and following up with his own right hand. So that was a bit of a head scratcher to me. I don't know why he developed the right high guard, but then didn't utilize the left. Another defense was sometimes when he would lean away from the right overhand, he would sort of shoulder roll it. Again, I don't know if this is intentional, but it was still good to see. And of course, he would often duck under them and just initiate the clinch because, you know, KSI made it so obvious it was coming. So in this exchange, KSI comes forward with the right overhand, and Logan actually catches him on the inside with this check left hook. And notice what he does. He throws the check left hook and then is able to circle on the same side he threw the punch back to the center of the ring. And Logan's pivoting ability also improved a lot, like in this exchange. So like here, Logan throws the right hand, and you know, I've spoken in the past, usually when you throw, say, your power hand, you want to slip out and duck away on the side you threw it, but Logan does something a little different here. So he kind of plants himself and actually puts more of his weight on his lead foot, his left foot, and he leans on it and kind of puts a weight on it and sort of uses that to pivot away back into his orthodox stance. And so that's an improvement for sure. One last improvement Logan made defensively was he was pretty solid at slipping to the outside of KSI's jab. So KSI started to utilize his jab a lot more in this fight to set up his right overhand, of course, and Logan had a pretty good anticipation of when the jab was coming and would often just slip right to the outside of it. And as we'll see later in the fight, this ended up setting up the counter right uppercut to KSI's jab, which we'll talk more on later. Another positive element was Logan Paul's pacing in the fight. His cardio was much improved, and I think that really came down to he was really pacing himself much more. You saw in the first fight, Logan Paul would just explode with the flurry of combinations, and this really proved to gas him out. But in this fight, he was a lot more measured and, didn't unload or blow his load too much early. Although, as we'll talk about, there was actually a downside to this in the sense that Logan's output was a lot lower in this fight than in the first fight. And so that might have, while improving his ability to last longer, might not have done him any favors in terms of getting the decision win. And if we look at the areas where Logan had the most success in this fight, a lot of them were very similar to the first fight, mainly, catching KSI with jabs, although this time he would jab more to the body. A lot of the times he would jab to the body, then jab to the face. But also he would catch KSI with 1-1-2 combinations, although unfortunately he didn't throw enough of these. And the biggest one was probably the counters, being the check left hook against the right hand, which landed once really effectively. And then the other big one was the slip on the outside of KSI's jab, and then landing the uppercut down the middle. Now, I will note this sequence is kind of weird because KSI doesn't really fully commit with the jab and it almost lands short of Logan. So Logan was trying to slip to the outside of it anyways and still landed the uppercut. But yeah, just something to note there. But overall, Logan made some solid improvements in this fight. And a lot of those improvements, as I said, were defensive as well as countering. But unfortunately, he brought in many of the same lingering issues he had before, as well as some new issues that unfortunately cost him the fight. One prominent one that I'll note is Logan would just kind of get stuck in space sometimes after throwing a punch or a combination. So like in this sequence, Logan's able to land a solid jab on JJ, but the problem is after he lands the jab, it's almost like he kind of just stands upright and just looks at JJ, almost like he's taking pictures of his work or something, and he kind of just stands stationary and he's trying to kind of gauge and find a shot, but he's completely oblivious to the fact that JJ is going to come up and throw that big looping right overhand. So yeah, that was a bit of a problem. It was almost like Logan just doesn't do well in the phone booth style of fighting, right? If he couldn't stay on the outside and kind of control the distance, he really looked lost in those dirty inside exchanges that KSI wanted to get. Another thing was Logan would get cocky with his footwork sometimes, like in this exchange. So here KSI's coming forward, he throws the right overhand, and Logan's able to gallop back and shoulder roll the overhand, and then KSI tries to throw a follow-up left overhand, which Logan rightly blocks with his right hand, so things are looking good. But then as JJ continues his offense, he kind of gets Logan up against the ropes, and Logan tries to duck down away from the overhand, and the equilibrium shot lands right over the top of his head. And then the other really big elephant in the room is Logan's complete lack of composure in being able to handle a big situation. And I think you all know what I'm talking about here, and this is when after Logan Paul lands the gorgeous counter right uppercut, he completely lost composure. So Logan has KSI hurt here, there's no doubt about it. And after landing that right uppercut, he could have continued to throw combinations, he could have, circled out and reset the action. Any number of things would have been a better response here than what he proceeds to do. But what he ends up doing is he clinches the back of KSI's head, and this is beyond illegal in boxing. This is Daniel Cormier dirty boxing techniques you'd see in MMA. And so he grabs the back of his head, throws a big right uppercut, and then he tries to actually hit him in the back of the head with a rabbit punch as KSI is falling on the ground. And then he even tries to do it a second time here. This isn't acceptable. I think the 2-point deduction was a bit overkill, but dude, you can't be doing that. And there was one last huge thing for Logan Paul in this fight, and that was simply that he did not let his hands go. His volume in terms of power punches thrown and landed was significantly lower than the last fight. Now, unfortunately, their first fight was an amateur bout, so there was no statistical data taken during that matchup, so I can't exactly prove it in those terms. But one thing we do have is statistics from the second fight, which show very clearly that Logan Paul's power hand volume was significantly lower than KSI's. I think there's a reason for that. He did at times unload with 5, 6, 7 punch combinations in the first fight, and that definitely contributed to him gassing out. So his attacks were a little bit more singular. So I get that he wants to pace himself out, but it got to a point where I'm watching the 5th and 6th round here, and I'm just like, dude, this guy is not throwing at all. And it was mainly the power hands. Shannon was shouting at him to throw 1-1-2s, and he lands a great one at the beginning of the 5th round, and then he just proceeds to not throw a lot of right hands for the rest of the fight. So yeah, that was definitely a step back for Logan for sure. There would be times where Logan would have KSI up against the ropes and he's pressuring him and KSI's, guarding up and his body's exposed. How about a right hook to the body here, Logan? How about a left hook to the body? But Logan just kind of sits there, and again, it's like he's taking pictures of his work or something. And then he allows KSI to just come forward with a right overhand and he loses his advantage. And so ultimately, it was not only the lack of Logan to have the proper composure when he did actually effectively counter KSI that lost him the fight, but it was also just his complete lack of volume and output that cost him this matchup. So that was the 2 fights with KSI, and regardless of some of the lingering issues Logan had, you can definitely still see a progression in the right direction for him that you'd think would likely come to fruition in his next fight. Unfortunately, that's not really the case when your next fight is against the greatest boxer of our generation in Floyd Mayweather. Now, I'm going to be honest, this fight was a bit of a train wreck to analyze because obviously the complete gap of skill between the two of them definitely impacted Logan's performance. So it's a lot easier, say, to look at the first KSI fight and compare it to the second and see clearly where the improvements were made just simply because the caliber of opponent was so much lower. And if we consider Floyd's game plan and his ability to basically mitigate anything Logan tried to do, it kind of all comes together. And Floyd's plan was very simple, almost identical to the McGregor fight. It was take a defensive approach in the early rounds, stay on the back foot to gauge the distance and timing of Logan, and then he would proceed to come forward with heavy pressure, a lot of head movement, slipping Logan's punches, standing his ground, and then finding his shots, whether by coming forward and attacking with, say, the left hook or the right hand, or he would just counter Logan when Logan finally did throw a big right hand, and just pretty much eventually wear and tire out the bigger man. And of course, there was going to be tons of openings for Floyd to work with here, not only just due to Logan's lack of defense, but also just out of reaction time. You know, even a 40-year-old Floyd is going to be faster and quicker and more precise than Logan. Also, just the fact that, you know, Floyd could easily manipulate Logan with movement and an opening could present itself. So in a way, this fight was kind of similar to the KSI fights in the sense that Logan was the one being pressured and was going to have to rely on his more defensive and countering abilities. The only problem was he was fighting someone with the most impeccable defense known to boxing. Right, KSI was not a master of the Philly shell style of defense. And despite the fact that Mayweather's shots were a lot more telegraphed this time around than previous fights, his ability to control the setups was just something that Logan had never experienced before. So I'm just going to touch on a couple technical points about what we saw from Logan in this fight. Most of them are going to be pretty critical, but again, just keep in mind the caliber of opponent he's fighting. So let's talk about the arm punches, because my goodness, we saw a lot of arm punches from Logan in this fight. And for those of you who don't know, arm punches are basically just punches without any whip behind them, where basically you're not in position, you're not throwing your hips into them, so they tend to be pretty weak and not very effective. And there were a few reasons why this happened. I mean, the biggest being that Mayweather was basically triggering this response out of Logan with his heavy trunk movement. So if Floyd's crouching or dipping down really low and his head's exposed, Logan's just like, hey, I should go after his head. And this led to some pretty comical exchanges where Logan's trying to arm punch his head and Floyd's just able to dip away at the last second. But I think there's actually another reason why these arm punches took place. I think part of it has to do with Logan being the bigger man. When Floyd's fighting these more inexperienced boxers or MMA fighters who have the size advantage, you know, they tend to clinch up a lot more, and just from getting closer to the opponent, you're kind of tempted to arm punch a little bit more. But the other thing is Logan had such a long reach. When he's close to Floyd like this, he's able to post on him with his left hand. So there's kind of a sense of, hey, I'm kind of probing with this left hand. He's kind of staying here. I can throw this punch safely. When in reality, you know, Floyd's able to get away no problem. And it's also just lack of composure and experience. I mean, obviously a professional boxer would know to position up first before throwing a shot. But the funniest example of this was the massive flurry Logan throws at Floyd in the first round, which was interesting because the first round was actually the only round Logan really was able to back Floyd up for a period of time. Right, he backed him up against the ropes and was able to throw a couple of overhands, but Floyd obviously ducked under them, and at this point, after missing the overhand, he's able to clinch up with Floyd. And this is where technique just goes out the window. Logan proceeds to unload with a barrage of arm punches, pretty much none of which land clean. And I can kind of understand why Logan would unload like this. I mean, this was pretty much the only opportunity he had the entire fight to do any meaningful damage. And, you know, who knows, maybe one of these rabbit punches hits him on the back of the head and could cause a flash equilibrium knockdown or something, but almost all these are either blocked or just don't land clean. And Floyd's guarded up here. I mean, his body was exposed. Logan could have went to the body, but for some reason he just decides to spam hooks to the head, which are all blocked. And then he finishes it up by just running at Floyd, throwing these punches like he's Superman or something. I mean, this was just bizarre to watch. So yeah, the arm punches were bad. The other thing was Logan's lack of defense when Floyd was pressuring him. He pretty much did not have anything for Floyd's pressure other than a posting jab, which Floyd was able to evade and duck under with ease. And then once the jab wasn't working, Logan tried to just throw out a couple desperate right hands. His biggest one was probably his counter right uppercut, which he tried to catch Floyd with coming in. But for the most part, Floyd was able to punish Logan when he would do this by just throwing that short inside left hook. Right, Floyd had the speed advantage, so, you know, usually he would just let Logan pump a jab out, and then right when he retracted his jab and was about to either throw another jab or a right hand, Floyd would then land the left hook on the inside. And another reason was Logan's right guard would be down sometimes, so that's another reason why the left hook would land. And then similarly, sometimes Floyd would get to the outside of Logan's jab with the right hand, or would punish Logan with the pull 1-2 if Logan loaded up for a big right overhand. But credit to Logan's chin, because he took a lot of Floyd's best punches in this fight and was able to continue fighting pretty well. And there were two instances where Logan at least landed something on Floyd that kind of made it interesting. The first was towards the beginning of the fourth round, and Floyd is kind of pressuring Logan up against the ropes and sort of moving forward with his trunk movement. So Floyd ducks down in front of Logan, and he's about to move forward and come up. And I don't know if Floyd just didn't expect Logan to throw the jab here, because in the previous round he kind of danced in front of him with this trunk movement, and Logan kind of stood there frozen. So maybe he didn't expect the jab to come out, but Floyd must have misread the timing or the range of Logan's jab, and Logan just lands the jab clean and like intercepts him right when he comes up. And then Logan follows it up with this right overhand, which lands clean right over the top of Floyd's lead hand. And this was easily the biggest shot Logan landed the entire fight. This sequence is weird in slow-mo because it almost looks like Floyd knew he moved forward a little bit too quickly, and so he doesn't even do anything to block it or move back. He just kind of braces to anticipate the punch, and he takes it quite well. And there was one other instance in the third round where Logan was able to clinch up with Mayweather and then land this nice right uppercut splitting right through his guard. And this is something I would have liked to have seen from Logan more in the fight, right? Because this leads into another point. Logan's other big defensive strategy was to clinch, and as we saw towards the end of the fight, that was basically all Logan was doing. So Logan would often shoulder bump into the clinch whenever he felt overwhelmed from Floyd, and of course given the size and strength disparity between the two men, Logan was going to have the advantage here in being able to turn and manipulate Floyd's body to his will. I mean, there were times where he clinched up with Floyd and he was able to literally walk him all the way from one side of the ring to the other. And given that this was an exhibition match, the ref was actually pretty lenient in letting these exchanges take place. Even to the point where Logan was just kind of holding Floyd up against the ropes for a sustained period of time, and Floyd was actually getting upset and would just verbally express himself like, hey, this guy needs to stop holding me. I mean, if Ben Askren had this much time to work with in the Jake Paul fight, we might have seen a completely different fight, right? So this should have been an advantage for Logan because he's basically able to muscle his way into a better position, but unfortunately Logan didn't really do much with the clinch when he had it, right? Other than that initial uppercut where he was actually in position and able to land the uppercut effectively and actually do some damage, most of the time he kind of just relied on these arm punches when he was in the clinch. And as we said before, these really aren't that effective. Right, when Logan's in the clinch here, this might have been a good opportunity for him to use the turn move like what I pointed out in the Ben Askren sparring video, or he could just clinch up and then disengage and then immediately re-engage, which he actually did once in the 7th round. So in this sequence, Floyd comes forward and Logan again shoulder bumps and initiates the clinch, and Floyd kind of pushes away from him here, so it's hard to say if Logan completely initiated this disengagement, but either way, the second they disengage, Floyd's hands are down and Logan's in a prime position to pump out that posting jab, which actually lands clean. But this was really the only time we saw this from Logan. Most of the time he was kind of just holding on to survive. And then just to give some final closing thoughts, I mean, it was really interesting seeing Logan duck and slip under so many of Floyd's punches. Now, Floyd's attacks were a lot more telegraphed this time around, especially his left hook, which Logan was ducking under a lot. But it wasn't just the left hook. I mean, he was slipping to the outside of Floyd's jab sometimes. Even at sometimes he would pull back on the right cross. Definitely an improvement in that area for sure. And I'll say this, Logan got a lot more work up against the ropes this fight than any of his 2 previous fights and looked a hell of a lot more confident there than before. I mean, a lot of the times Mayweather was just toying with him here, kind of using his trunk movement and dipping down multiple times just to see the reactions out of Logan. But Logan was still able to get away unscathed sometimes, like in this exchange where Floyd leans to his left to try to slip in this right hand and Logan sees it coming and just slips right to the outside of it perfectly, and then he clinches up to get back to safety. Right, the Logan in the first KSI fight would have panicked in this situation, so it's good to see Logan more comfortable in these uncomfortable positions. And that's pretty much all I have to say. I've probably done way too much over-analysis for one of the most subpar professional boxers of our time here. But in conclusion, like all celebrity and YouTube boxers, we gotta give him credit for getting in the ring. Logan Paul has definitely made some progression in this sport. As we've seen from his first KSI fight to the Mayweather fight, there was some regression in some areas, but there was a lot of improvements in other areas. It's clear that boxing has had an immensely positive impact on his life, transforming him into one of the most toxic people on YouTube to actually a pretty honest, genuine, good guy. At the end of the day, I think his brother Jake is a better and more technical boxer, and I would love to see Logan fight someone more on his level to see really how he's progressed since the KSI fight, because as I mentioned, the Mayweather fight kind of mitigated a lot of his skills. So thanks so much for watching. My apologies if this video was way overly long. There was a huge learning curve here with the voiceover and being able to be more precise with my points. I'm going to try to make these videos a little shorter and more precise, so just bear with me as time goes on. And again, thank you so much for watching. This is Kiwi MMA, over and out.